When I first set out to become a writer, this lesson on sentence structure and cadence is the one I most desperately needed, but I couldn't find it anywhere. So, 4 years later, I've decided to teach the fundamentals myself. Have you ever read your writing and it just sounds off, but you don't know why, or how to fix it? Well, I've assembled a list of the most fundamental sentence structures you're likely to need, and have categorized them based on the punctuation and conjunctions that distinguish them. And all so that I can show you, not only what the building blocks of your prose look like, but how you can string them together to create a desired cadence or rhythm. If this sounds overwhelming or overly technical, try not to worry. While this topic has its complexities, I've done my very best to simplify them. And, as always, I have a comprehensive example waiting at the end of this video so I can show you how to apply all the techniques described herein. Note that not every rule I state is absolute, nor every list I give exhaustive. There are always exceptions in writing. What I offer here is a solid scaffolding or foundation for your narrative prose. Let's begin with the first of the 5 sentence structures, one I've named active structure. This category covers all sentence structures which use the active voice, the most basic structure being Bob knocked an arrow, as opposed to the passive voice, the arrow was knocked by Bob. If you want to learn more about writing in the active voice and how it allows you to show instead of tell, a common piece of writing advice, I've linked my earlier video on that in the description below. These active structures will make up the bulk of a well-written novel's prose, so consider them most fundamental. Note that I've generated all these structures with a common scene in mind, namely, a man named Bob hunting deer with a bow in a winter forest. So let's read through them and give your brain a chance to digest. Basic structure. Bob knocked an arrow. Comma structure. Bob knocked an arrow, drew it back to his cheek. Comma and structure. Bob knocked an arrow and drew it back to his cheek. Double comma and structure. Bob knocked an arrow, drew it back to his cheek, and let fly. Comma but structure. Bob knocked an arrow, but his fingers fumbled it. As while structure. The deer bolted as the bowstring thrummed. Semicolon structure. Bob knocked an arrow. He hadn't caught sight of any prey, but wanted to be ready. Double semicolon structure. His arms trembled, fingers ached, breath eased. Semicolon mirror structure. Bob could not find a clean shot, could not find new ground, and risk a twig breaking underfoot. Semicolon mirror emphasis structure. Till his lungs burned, Bob chased that wounded deer. Till the sun fell and the wolves howled, he chased it. M dash structure. Bob knocked an arrow, his last broadhead. M dash sandwich structure. Bob took aim at the white-tailed deer, an 8-point buck, and let fly. Comma then structure. Bob dropped the first deer with an arrow, then fired at another. And comma then structure. Bob knocked an arrow and crept through the undergrowth, then drew his bow and fired. ING verb comma structure. Crouching in the ferns, Bob knocked an arrow. Comma ing verb structure. Bob drew his bow, straining against the weight. Comma lest structure. Bob knocked an arrow, lest he stumble upon a deer unprepared. Comma save structure. All Bob's fingertips ached, save his pinky. Nada, comma, nora structure. Not a bird sang, nor a squirrel skittered. The second category of sentence structure is what I'm calling descriptive structure. This is because you will often see these structures when describing people, places, or things, or when glossing over events. However, since these structures are written in the passive voice and a diligent writer strives to use the active voice in descriptions when possible, these structures aren't particularly crucial. I've included them simply because they exist and can be mixed with active structures to form hybrid structures, as you'll see shortly. Let's go through them. Basic structure. His jacket was brown. And structure. His jacket was brown and rugged. Comma and structure. His jacket was brown and his trousers patched. Double comma and structure. His jacket was brown, his trousers patched, and his boots worn. Comma, semicolon, comma, and structure. His jacket was brown, his trousers patched, his boots worn, and his mittens creased. Comma, but structure. His jacket was old leather, but it kept him warm enough. Colon, list, structure. Bob's hunting philosophy was comprised of 3 things: hunt what you eat what you kill, and don't kill more than you can eat. Colon, elaboration, structure. Bob was a troubled man. He drank daily and cursed often. The Hemingway. The pines were snow-covered and the day was cold and cloudy, and he saw the tracks of rabbits and squirrels imprinted on the snow, and the stillness of the winter forest was soothing, and anything that moved was stark and ruined it. Metaphor. The snow was a white blanket. Next, we have what I'm calling hybrid structures. These are active and descriptive structures combined through the use of punctuation. The most basic form of this would probably be active structure, comma, descriptive structure, as in the example, Bob marched over to the fallen deer, tears in his eyes. The first half is active, with Bob marched, and the second half is a description of Bob. Let's go through the rest of them. Comma, double description structure. Bob marched over to the fallen deer, camouflaged and mud-smeared. Sandwiched description structure. The carcass reeked, its flesh rotten, and flies swarmed around it. Double sandwich description structure. The carcass reeked, its flesh rotten, bones gnawed, and flies swarmed around it. Semicolon description structure. Bob marched over to the fallen deer. Camouflaged and mud-smeared, he was but another green fixture in this wild place. Comma, elaboration structure. Bob huddled against the bitter winds, cold as only the tundra bred them. Simile structure. The arrowhead pierced hide like a cougar's fangs. Now, before I show you all the structures of the next two categories, continuations and transitions, let's talk a bit about cadence, the very thing these structures are devoted to. Essentially, the cadence, or rhythm, of narrative prose is how seamlessly one sentence transitions into the next throughout the entire scene. Cadence has two principal components, in my view, each of which correspond to the last two categories of sentence structure. One component is what I'm calling continuous writing, which is when each successive sentence builds upon, or relates to, the last, and together form a continuous sequence. This is comprised of what I'm calling continuations, the fourth category, which do not define a set of sentence structures per se, but rather the stringing together of sentences. You want to ensure that the structure of the sentence you're writing doesn't clash with the structure of the one that came before it and ruin the cadence. The better you get at doing this in your first draft, the less editing you'll have to do later. Here, cadence is achieved primarily through avoiding repetition. This means don't place ands, buts, thens, or he/she's too close to other ands, buts, thens, or he/she's, and don't repeat the exact same sentence structures back to back, with a few exceptions we'll touch on. Each successive sentence is a continuation of the last until the writing is directed to another sequence, though not necessarily when shifting to a different subject. And it is this shift that makes up the second half of cadence, what I'm calling the transition. But let's read through my table of continuations before we go there. I can hardly make a list of every compatible sentence structure, but here's a few foundational ones I use often, as well as several which are great for making your writing more concise and immediate. Let's go through them. Basic active structure, following comma and active structure. Bob knocked an arrow. He drew the feathers to his cheek and exhaled. Basic active structure, following comma but active structure. Bob knocked an arrow. He drew the feathers to his cheek, but could not send it through the deer's heart. Basic active structure, following basic active structure. Bob drew the feathers to his cheek. The bow's limbs groaned. Comma and active structure, following comma but active structure. Bob knocked an arrow and drew the feathers to his cheek. He exhaled, but couldn't send it through the deer's heart. Then structure. Bob knocked an arrow and drew it to his cheek, then sent it through the deer's heart. Associated action structure. Bob drew his bow, gripped it tight. Elaboration structure. The arrow pierced the deer's breast, an inch below its heart. And structure. Bob knocked an arrow, drew it back to his cheek, and exhaled. But, period, and structure. But Bob's bow had its limits, and the deer was beyond them. As did structure. Bob's nose stung in the cold, as did his bare bowstring fingers. Now, in order to distinguish between continuations and transitions, let's examine this fight scene I've written between a man named Bob and his nemesis, Tim. Bob punched Tim in the cheek, grunted as an uppercut rammed his guts, and cracked Tim again, a left hook to the man's jaw. But while his blows landed hard, Tim resisted, blacking out as only a drunkard could. The man spat out a tooth and swung for the fences. Bob huddled behind his forearms as relentless blows rained down upon him. He attempted a counter, and woke up on the concrete. Let's start with the continuations. We have a associated action continuation, a and continuation, a comma and active structure continued with an as active structure, and the as structure continued with a basic active structure. And notice where I've placed the ands, where I've placed the buts, and where I've placed the names. None are too close to one another. Writing will always be continuous when showing the actions of Bob, and can even remain continuous when shifting to the actions of Tim. But when things take a turn, in this case for the worse, A transition is what's used to smooth over the cadence. You can accomplish a lot by mixing active structures, passive structures, and hybrid structures with well-chosen continuations, but without transitions, you might still write yourself into a corner. And by that, I mean you've written a few sentences or paragraphs, but can't figure out a structure for the next sentence that doesn't sound jarring, abrupt, or repetitive. This is where transitions come in. Let's read through them. And structure. Bob knocked an arrow, drew it back to his cheek, and let fly. But undesirable action, structure. Bob let fly his arrow, but the deer bolted at the thrum of its release. But/yet revelation, structure. Bob knocked an arrow, drew it back to his cheek, but he could not send it into the deer's heart. But/yet still, structure. His lungs burned, heart hammered, legs ached, but still he ran. But not before, structure. Bob let fly his arrow, but not before the deer bolted. But no sooner had he than, structure. Bob knocked an arrow, but no sooner had he drawn it back than the deer bolted. But while, structure. Bob let fly his arrow, but while it soared true, the deer bolted at the thrum of its release. And while, structure. Bob let fly his arrow, and while the deer perked up at the thrum of his release, the arrow pierced the animal's heart before it could flee. Until, structure. Eyes down, Bob followed the deer's tracks, until a growl from behind told him he wasn't the only hunter in these woods. However, structure. Tim shrieked and ran from the bear. Bob, however, chose to fight. Meanwhile, structure. Meanwhile, the birds sang and the wind whistled. Internal monologue. Come on, Delilah, right in the heart, you know the way. In the previous example, you can see I used two transitions. The but while transition alludes to the tables turning in Tim's favor, and the and transition sets up the next sequence, where Bob discovers he's lost the fight and been knocked out. Note how the context of the scene determines what I consider a and continuation and a and transition. Does it carry on with the sequence or set up a new one? Now, let's dissect an example that ties together everything we've discussed. Bob knocked an arrow, ran his calloused fingers over the crisp, trimmed feathers, and hooked them over the bowstring. Not a bird sang in this snowy forest of frozen, huddled pines, nor did a squirrel chatter. And all the better, for Bob preferred silence when he killed. Not 20 yards from the tip of his razor broadhead stood an 8-point buck, head hung low as it scavenged beneath the snow, an animal he'd not stumbled upon, but tracked in fair contest. The limbs of his bow creaked, feathers brushed his cheek, his barren stomach groaned, and his rotten tooth reeked. Come on, Delilah, right in the heart, you know the way. The bowstring thrummed, blistered his bare fingertips, and the arrow plunged feather deep in the deer's hide. The animal bolted, but wouldn't run far with a leaking heart. A trickled trail of blood melted the snow and grew only redder. Bob smiled. For long hours and longer miles he'd trekked, through silence and bitter cold, and his persistence had been rewarded. No longer would his family hunger. No, he had provided. Tonight his wife and daughter would eat venison. Now, let's examine the structure of each sentence. This first sentence, Bob knocked an arrow, is a basic active structure, which lends it a blunt and immediate feel. I find this simplistic structure works well to grab the reader, so if you're having trouble starting your scene or chapter, try beginning with a concise, active statement like this. Next, I use an associated action continuation, saying, ran his calloused fingers over the crisp, trimmed feathers and hooked them over the bowstring. I do this to avoid repeating the subject of the sentence, as the reader knows it's still Bob. Though, if I were to say, he ran his calloused fingers, that would be fine too. But I find this continuation really carries the reader along and provides a smooth cadence here, as the word his follows ran, so the word he doesn't feel like it's missing. The sentence itself is active and has the structure, comma, and. This next sentence, not a bird sang in this snowy forest of frozen, huddled pines, nor did a squirrel chatter, while being descriptive, is actually active. Note how the verbs sang and chatter immediately follow the subjects bird and squirrel, respectively. And it has the structure nada, comma, nora. This structure is good when trying to convey the absence of things. Note how I avoided using and here, because it was used in the previous sentence. Next we have the sentence, and all the better, for Bob preferred silence when he killed. This is the first transition, and has a variation of the and structure. The sentence structure itself is actually a bit ambiguous, which just goes to show how much variation exists. But while it sounds a little active, what with Bob preferred and he killed, I tend to think of sentences like this as more descriptive, because the actions are rather hypothetical, and really, I'm just describing a bit of Bob's character. I was also able to use and here, because there is no and in the previous sentence. Now, coming out of the transition, I have a good example of how you can disguise descriptive sentences as active ones. Not 20 yards from the tip of his razor broadhead stood an 8-point buck, head hung low as it scavenged beneath the snow. Note how I say stood an 8-point buck instead of was an 8-point buck, which is a sneaky word because while it's associated with the action of standing, I'm using it here to describe a stationary deer. I also say head hung and it scavenged. Scavenged is the only truly active verb here, because, once again, I'm not saying the deer hung its head, but rather that its head was down. I've just weaseled my way out of saying was, as is ideal. Overall, I'm leaning toward calling this a comma, double description, hybrid structure, but seeing as this naming convention mainly just served to organize my thoughts, I suppose the name doesn't really matter too much. I continue on with an animal he'd not stumbled upon, but tracked in fair contest. This continuation has the structure elaboration, as it provides additional information and relates directly to the previous sentence. I could have used an em dash instead of a period between these two, but thought that would make the sentence a bit too long. This sentence has an active comma but structure, while being written in past perfect tense, and I used but essentially because I hadn't used one yet and thought I'd make some space for the next and. I'm always making room for the next and. This next sentence, the limbs of his bow creaked, is actually a transition, though in context only, not structure. Now that I've set the scene a little, I'm using this basic active structure to bring the reader back to Bob drawing his bow. I continue with feathers brushed his cheek. This sentence is an associated action continuation, associated in the sense that it relates to the drawing of the bow, and has the basic active structure. I followed this up with his barren stomach groaned and his rotten tooth reeked. This sentence is part of the same sequence, so it's a continuation, and while it is descriptive, again, it's written in the active voice and has the comma and active structure. It's been a while since I've used this structure, so the cadence doesn't suffer. And note my, hopefully, tasteful use of a rhyme scheme here. The limbs of his bow creaked, feathers brushed his cheek, his barren stomach groaned, and his rotten tooth reeked. But since I quickly break the rhyme scheme in the following sentence, it stands alone in a way I think has a nice cadence to it. Next, I use internal monologue as my transition between Bob drawing his bow, Delilah, and firing her. Come on, Delilah, right in the heart, you know the way. I find this technique particularly effective when used right before an impactful action that propels the plot forward. I begin this new continuity with the bowstring thrummed, a basic active structure. It's immediate and packs a punch, which is exactly what I want. I then use the elaboration continuation, blistered his bare fingertips, to actively provide some concise, visceral description. Then use the and continuation, and the arrow plunged feather deep in the deer's hide, to end this sequence. Again, the word and hasn't been used in a while. Next, I transition with the active but structure. The animal bolted, but wouldn't run far with a leaking heart, to guide the reader away from Bob and toward the deer. I haven't used but in a while, so there are no conflicts here. Always be careful not to use too many but structures. I continue the sequence with a trickled trail of blood melted the snow and grew only redder, which has an active comma and structure. Note how I once more use active structures to describe in favor of passive descriptions. I then use the active basic structure, Bob smiled, as my next transition, so I can guide the reader a bit closer to Bob's perspective and what he's thinking. And since my previous sentence ended with an and structure, I can use a blunt basic sentence here. I continue on with, for long hours and longer miles he'd trekked, which is a comma description hybrid structure in the past perfect tense to give the reader a sense of how hard won this victory was for Bob. Then I use the elaboration continuation, through silence and bitter cold, to hammer this home and give further description of his environment. Next, I use the sentence, and his persistence had been rewarded, as my final transition. It has the and structure and hones in on Bob's motivations. I then write, no longer would his family hunger, which, again, is fundamentally descriptive, but disguised as active. I could have said, no longer would his family be hungry, but chose to use the word hunger as a verb to give it an active sound. I end the scene with, no, he'd provided. Tonight, his wife and daughter would eat venison. This is an elaboration continuation, building on the sentence before it, and has the active semicolon structure. It hammers home Bob's motivations, and also conveys his satisfaction. Now, I know this may seem overwhelming, but you should know, the more you write, the more all this becomes intuitive. I made this video in the hopes of offering you writing tools, helping you problem solve, and showing you a spectrum of possibilities. Don't let it stifle your creativity. Let me know if anything was unclear, or if something I said gave rise to a question I didn't answer. Otherwise, tune in next week for another technical writing video.